So here's the thing about inheritances. They're never as simple as they seem on paper. When my Uncle Pete's lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited his cabin up in West Virginia, I figured it was just some old hunting shack that would need more money than it was worth to fix up. Pete had always been the weird uncle, you know? The one who showed up to family gatherings smelling like wood smoke and telling stories nobody quite believed about the mountains. I hadn't seen him in maybe 5 years when the cancer took him. The lawyer, this thin guy named Harwood who sounded like he gargled gravel, told me Pete had been pretty specific about the inheritance. The cabin was mine, free and clear, but I had to come collect a package he'd left for me personally. Couldn't mail it, couldn't have someone else pick it up. Had to be me in person. Your uncle was very insistent about that, Harwood said over the phone. Said it was important safety information. That should have been my first red flag, but I was broke in between freelance gigs, so a free cabin sounded like exactly what I needed. Maybe I could fix it up and flip it, or at least have somewhere to hole up and work without paying Chicago rent prices. The drive from Chicago to the mountains of West Virginia took about 6 hours, most of it on interstate until I hit those twisty mountain roads that made my Honda Civic groan with every switchback. GPS worked fine until I got to the last 20 miles, then it just gave up like even satellites didn't want to deal with this part of the world. I stopped at a gas station in a town called Millbrook, and I use the word town pretty generously here. We're talking maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a single main drag, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and strangers get stared at like they're aliens. The old guy working the register looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself, weathered face, hands like tree bark, and eyes that seemed to see way more than they should. You wouldn't happen to know where Cedar Ridge Road is, would you? I asked, showing him the address Harwood had given me. His expression changed immediately. Not hostile exactly, but careful. You're Pete Morgan's nephew, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, how did you? Pete mentioned you might be coming by. Said you looked like your mama. He studied my face like he was memorizing it. Name's Earl Whitman. I run this place. Daniel Hayes, I said, extending my hand. His grip was firm but quick, like he didn't want to touch me any longer than necessary. Cedar Ridge Road's about 3 miles north, Earl said, pointing through the window. Follow the main road until you see the old church with the crooked steeple, then turn left onto the dirt road. Keep going until you can't go anymore. Thanks, I appreciate it. I was turning to leave when Earl called after me. Son. Yeah. Pete was a good man. Smart man. Whatever he left for you up there, you pay attention to it. These mountains got their own ways, and city folk who don't respect that, well, they don't last long. The way he said it made my skin crawl a little, but I just nodded and headed back to my car. Small town weirdness, I figured. Every rural area had its share of locals who liked to spook outsiders with talk about how dangerous and mysterious their little corner of nowhere was. The dirt road Earl had mentioned was more like a suggestion of a road, 2 tire tracks with grass growing between them, winding up into hills covered with trees so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. My car bottomed out on rocks and roots every few hundred yards, and I started wondering if I'd need a tow truck to get back out. After about 20 minutes of driving that felt like an hour, the trees opened up into a clearing, and there it was, Uncle Pete's cabin. It was bigger than I'd expected, actually pretty nice. 2 stories of dark wood with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that looked like it could handle some serious fires. Solar panels on the roof caught my attention. Pete had been more modern than I'd given him credit for. A generator shed sat off to one side, and I could see a well pump housing near what looked like a pretty decent vegetable garden. But what really struck me was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just this heavy silence that felt like the forest was holding its breath. I parked next to Pete's old Ford pickup and grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat. The porch steps creaked under my weight, but they felt solid. Pete had maintained this place well. The front door was unlocked, which seemed crazy to me until I realized we were probably 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Who was going to break in? Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. Hardwood floors, stone fireplace, leather furniture that looked worn but well cared for. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed with everything from hunting guides to local history books to what looked like academic texts on folklore and mythology. A kitchen area took up one corner, modern appliances running off what I assumed was the solar setup. On the kitchen table sat a manila envelope with my name written on it in Pete's careful handwriting. I opened it up and found 3 things: the deed to the property already signed over to me, a letter, and a small brass key. The letter was 2 pages, front and back, covered in Pete's neat script. Daniel. Asterisk, if you're reading this, I'm dead and you're probably wondering why I left you this place. Truth is, You're the only family member who ever believed my stories, even as a kid. Remember when I told you about the things I'd seen in these mountains, and you didn't laugh or roll your eyes like everyone else? That's why it's you and not your cousins or your dad. Asterisk. Asterisk. This cabin has been in our family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it in 1897, and every Morgan who's lived here since has learned the same hard truths I'm about to share with you. Asterisk. Asterisk. These mountains are old, Daniel. Older than the Cherokee who used to live here, older than the first European settlers. There are things in these hills that were here before humans ever set foot in North America, and they're still here now. Most of the time they leave people alone. But sometimes they don't. Asterisk. Asterisk. The key in this envelope opens the lockbox under my bed upstairs. Inside you'll find what I call the rules. They're not suggestions, they're not guidelines, they're the absolute requirements for staying alive in this place. Every single rule was written in someone's blood, if you catch my meaning. Asterisk. Asterisk. I know how this sounds. I know you're probably thinking the old man finally lost it completely. But before you dismiss this as the ravings of a crazy hermit, ask yourself, how do you think I managed to live alone in these mountains for 30 years without so much as a serious injury? How did I make it to 73 when mountain living is supposed to be so dangerous? Asterisk. The answer is simple. I followed the rules. Asterisk. You don't have to stay, Daniel. You can sell this place and head back to Chicago and never think about it again. But if you do decide to stay, even for a few days, you follow every single rule exactly as written. No exceptions, no modifications, no, I'll just bend this one a little bit. The things in these mountains don't negotiate, and they sure as hell don't forgive. Asterisk. One more thing. If you decide this isn't for you, sell the property to someone local. Someone who understands what they're getting into. Don't sell it to city developers or weekend warriors who think they can tame this place. They won't last a month and their blood will be on your hands. Asterisk. Asterisk. Good luck, nephew. I hope I taught you enough respect for the unknown to keep you breathing. Asterisk. Uncle Pete. Asterisk. P.S. The generator runs on propane. Tank's full, but there's 2 spares in the shed. Solar batteries are good for about 3 days without sun. Check the weather radio every morning. When storms come through these mountains, they come fast and mean. Asterisk. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking a little by the time I finished. This was not what I'd been expecting. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as exactly what it sounded like, the paranoid fantasies of an old man who'd lived alone too long. But Pete had always been sharp, always been practical. Even his weirdest stories had a kernel of truth to them. And there was something about the cabin, about the oppressive silence outside, that made the letter feel more real than I wanted it to. I climbed the narrow staircase to the loft bedroom, a cozy space with slanted ceilings and windows that looked out over the treetops. Pete's bed was a simple wooden frame with a thick quilt that smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. The lockbox was exactly where he'd said it would be, a heavy metal thing bolted to the floor joist. The brass key fit perfectly, and the lid opened with a soft click. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound notebook, a cloth bag that clinked when I picked it up, and a small wooden cross that looked hand-carved. I opened the notebook to the first page and immediately felt my blood run cold. At the top of the page, written in Pete's careful handwriting, were the words, "Rules for staying alive, break them and die." Below that was a list of 12 rules, each one more bizarre than the last. 1. Never go outside between sunset and sunrise without iron in your hand. 2. If something calls your name from the forest, do not answer. Do not acknowledge. Do not look. 3. Every night before bed, place a line of salt across every threshold, doors, windows, everything. 4. If you hear scratching on the roof, do not investigate. Add more wood to the fire and wait for sunrise. 5. Never follow strange lights in the forest, no matter how lost you are. 6. If you find animal bones arranged in patterns, do not disturb them. Leave an offering of tobacco and walk away. 7. The well water is safe to drink, but only during daylight hours. After sunset, use bottled water only. 8. If someone knocks on your door after dark claiming to need help, do not open it. No matter what they say, no matter how they sound, do not open that door. 9. Keep a fire burning in the fireplace from sunset to sunrise, October through March. The creatures fear fire. 10. If you see glowing eyes watching you from the treeline, maintain eye contact and back slowly toward the house. Never run. Running triggers the hunt. 11. On nights when the moon is dark, sleep downstairs near the fire. Something comes down from the high places when there's no moonlight. 12. If you ever find human footprints circling the cabin that aren't your own, pack everything you can carry and leave immediately. don't come back for at least a month. Below the list were dozens of pages covered in Pete's handwriting, dates, observations, additional notes and clarifications. I flipped through them quickly, catching fragments. October 15th, scratching lasted from midnight until 3 a.m. Added extra logs to fire as per Rule 4. In morning, found claw marks on roof shingles, each one 4 inches long. November 23rd, heard my father's voice calling from the woods around 10 p.m. He's been dead 12 years. Did not respond per Rule 2. Voice kept calling until nearly dawn, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. Not Dad. Never was Dad. December 8th, new moon. Slept by the fire as per Rule 11. Good thing. Something big walked around the cabin most of the night. Footprints in the snow were human-shaped but 14 inches long. January 30th, found deer bones arranged in a perfect circle near the well. Left tobacco offering per Rule 6. When I came back the next day, the bones were gone, but there was a dead rabbit in their place, cleanly skinned. Understood. They were saying thank you. My hands were shaking as I read page after page of Pete's careful documentation. 30 years of encounters with things that shouldn't exist, all recorded in matter-of-fact language that made it impossible to dismiss as fantasy. The cloth bag contained iron nails, dozens of them in various sizes. All of them were old, hand-forged, the kind blacksmiths made before mass production. Each one had been wrapped in what looked like sage and blessed according to some ritual I didn't understand. The wooden cross was carved from what might have been mountain laurel, worn smooth by decades of handling. Etched into its surface were symbols that weren't quite Christian and weren't quite anything else I could identify. I sat on Pete's bed for a long time, staring out the window at the forest that surrounded the clearing. The sun was getting low, painting everything in shades of gold and red that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous instead. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was elaborate fiction. Delusion brought on by isolation and too much time alone with folk tales and local legends. But another part of me, a deeper part that remembered being a kid and believing in monsters, whispered that Pete had never lied to me before. Why would he start now? The decision I made in that moment would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of packing up and driving back to Chicago like any sensible person would do, I decided to stay the night. Just one night. I told myself I was curious, that I wanted to see if any of Pete's rules would actually come into play. Looking back, I think the truth was simpler than that. I was broke, I was tired, and some part of me had always wondered if Pete's stories might be real. This felt like my chance to find out. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading through Pete's notebook and preparing the cabin according to his rules. I laid lines of salt across every threshold, using a container I found in the kitchen cabinet. I gathered iron nails and distributed them around the house, one in each room, extras by the doors and windows. I built a fire in the stone fireplace using seasoned wood from a stack on the back porch. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and reds, I began to understand why Pete had been so specific about his rules. The forest changed after dark. The oppressive silence of the afternoon gave way to sounds that seemed wrong somehow, rustling that was too deliberate, calls that sounded almost but not quite like known animals, and underneath it all, a sense of vast attention focused on the small circle of light around the cabin. I made dinner from canned goods I found in Pete's pantry, trying to act normal even as my nerves stretched tighter with each passing minute. The fire crackled reassuringly in the hearth, and the iron nails seemed to pulse with some kind of protective energy I couldn't explain. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first call. Daniel? Daniel Hayes. The voice came from somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, soft and questioning. A woman's voice, familiar but not quite placeable. Daniel, are you there? I need help. My whole body went rigid. Rule number 2 blazed through my mind. If something calls your name from the forest, do not answer. Do not acknowledge. Do not look. But God, it was hard not to respond. Every instinct screamed at me to go to the door, to call back, to help whoever was lost out there in the darkness. The voice sounded so human, so genuinely distressed. Daniel, please. I'm hurt. I clenched my fists and stared into the fire, forcing myself to follow Pete's rule. I didn't answer. I didn't look toward the windows. I just sat there and listened as the voice called my name over and over, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes barely above a whisper. It went on for hours. Somewhere around midnight, the calling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the voice had been, a waiting silence, like something was holding its breath right outside the circle of firelight. That's when I heard the scratching on the roof. Slow, deliberate scrapes that moved from one end of the cabin to the other. Back and forth like something was pacing up there. Something with very long claws. Rule number 4. Asterisk: if you hear scratching on the roof, do not investigate. Add more wood to the fire and wait for sunrise. Asterisk. I threw another log on the fire, then another. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made everything seem to move and shift in my peripheral vision. The scratching continued, sometimes directly overhead, sometimes moving to different sections of the roof. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't have even if I'd wanted to. I just sat by the fire, feeding it log after log, listening to something walk back and forth above my head until the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. When the sun finally came up, the scratching stopped abruptly. I waited another hour before I worked up the courage to step outside. The claw marks on the roof shingles were exactly like Pete had described: 4 parallel gouges, each one 4 inches long, carved deep enough into the wood to expose the lighter timber underneath. They covered the entire roof in a crisscross pattern that hurt to look at directly. No animal I knew of had claws that size. No animal I knew of could have climbed onto a roof without making noise, without disturbing the ladder or the trees around the cabin. But something had been up there. Something had spent the night pacing back and forth above my head, scratching messages into Pete's roof that I was afraid to try to decode. I stood in the morning sunlight, staring at those impossible marks, and realized that everything had changed. Pete's rules weren't delusions or folklore or the fantasies of an isolated old man. They were survival instructions for a world where monsters were real. And I had just spent my first night learning exactly why my uncle had followed them so carefully for 30 years. The worst part? This was only the beginning. I should have left that morning. Any sane person would have packed up, driven straight back to Chicago, and put the cabin on the market without ever looking back. But standing there in Pete's front yard, staring up at those claw marks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose. My life back in the city was a mess. Freelance writing barely paid the bills, my relationship had imploded 6 months ago, and I was living in a studio apartment that cost more per month than most people make in salary. Here was something real, something that mattered in a way my articles about restaurant reviews and local business profiles never had. Plus, I'll be honest, I was curious as hell. I spent the morning exploring the property more thoroughly. Pete had been busy over the years. The vegetable garden was bigger than I'd initially noticed, with raised beds full of herbs I didn't recognize alongside normal stuff like tomatoes and beans. A root cellar built into the hillside behind the cabin contained shelves lined with preserved foods, water containers, and medical supplies that would have made a survivalist jealous. Most interesting was what I found in the generator shed, not just the propane tanks Pete had mentioned, but an entire workshop area lined with tools and materials that seemed focused on a single purpose: working with iron. There was an anvil, a small forge, hammers and tongs, and bins full of raw iron stock. Finished pieces hung from hooks along the walls: horseshoes, nails, crosses, and shapes I couldn't identify but that felt important in a way that made my skin crawl. A workbench in the corner held Pete's current project. Dozens of iron spikes, each one about 8 inches long and sharpened to wicked points. Next to them was a hand-drawn map of the property with X marks scattered around the perimeter. It didn't take a genius to figure out what Pete had been planning. I found the first spike that afternoon, buried point up about 50 yards into the treeline along what must have been a game trail. The iron was black with age and weather, but it felt solid and purposeful in my hand. I left it exactly where Pete had placed it. By evening, I'd located 6 more spikes positioned around the cabin in what seemed like a deliberate pattern. Each one was placed at a spot where the forest pressed closest to the clearing, creating a barrier that was invisible but somehow palpable. Walking between the spikes and the cabin felt different than walking outside their perimeter: safer, more protected. Pete had been building defenses. I spent that second night reading through more of Pete's journal, trying to understand the logic behind his rules. The entries painted a picture of gradual learning, of a man who'd arrived in the mountains as skeptical as I was and slowly, painfully, been educated in realities that textbooks never covered. Year 2, still think some of this might be psychological. Isolation, suggestion, local folklore taking root in my subconscious. But the scratching is real. The marks are real. And last night I found footprints in the garden that weren't there when I went to bed. Year 5, beginning to understand there are rules to this. They don't attack randomly, there are patterns, limitations, things that constrain them. Iron definitely works, but only certain kinds. Modern steel does nothing. Has to be old iron, hand-forged if possible. The older the better. Year 8, made contact with something that might be friendly. Left tobacco offering near the bone circle as usual, but this time something left a response. 3 perfect white stones arranged in a triangle. Felt like a thank you. Asterisk. Asterisk year 12 bad winter. Things got desperate, started pushing boundaries they usually respect. Had to reinforce the iron barriers twice. Whatever's out there is getting hungrier or braver or both. Asterisk. Asterisk year 15 figured out the pattern. Activity increases with the moon cycle, peaks during new moon and certain times of year. Worst periods are October through February, especially around the solstices. Spring and summer are calmer but never completely safe. Asterisk. Asterisk year 20 they're learning. Tactics are evolving. Voice mimicry is getting better. Almost caught me with my mother's voice last month. Had my hand on the door handle before I remembered she's been dead 10 years. Asterisk. Asterisk year 25 found evidence of others who tried to live up here. Old foundation stones about 2 miles north, scattered bones that looked human. Some of the bones showed tooth marks that didn't match any known animal. Left tobacco and said a prayer. We all deserve better. Asterisk. The entries went on, documenting 3 decades of careful observation and hard-learned lessons. Pete had essentially become an expert on supernatural survival, developing strategies and defenses that had kept him alive in an environment that had killed others. Reading his journal was like getting a masterclass in monster hunting from someone who'd never wanted to be a monster hunter in the first place. Around 11 o'clock that second night, I heard something new: music. It started as a faint melody drifting through the forest, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. At first I thought it might be wind through the trees, but gradually it became clearer, a woman's voice singing something that sounded like a lullaby. The song was beautiful and heartbreaking, full of longing and sadness that made my chest ache. Without thinking, I found myself moving toward the window, drawn by the pure emotional pain in that voice. I had my hand on the window latch when Pete's journal entry blazed through my memory: voice mimicry is getting better. I jerked my hand back and returned to my chair by the fire, but the singing continued. 4 hours, that invisible woman sang lullabies and folk songs and melodies I'd never heard but felt like I'd known my whole life. Sometimes the voice seemed to come from right outside the window. Sometimes it was distant, floating down from the mountainside. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. The singing stopped just before dawn, replaced by that familiar waiting silence. When I finally worked up the courage to check outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the soft earth around the cabin there were footprints. Not the massive prints Pete had mentioned in some of his entries. These were normal-sized, human-looking prints that belonged to a woman wearing what looked like old-fashioned boots. But the prints circled the cabin 17 times. I counted. 17 perfect circles, one inside the other, spiraling inward toward the house like some kind of ritual pattern. The innermost circle came within 3 feet of the front porch. According to Pete's rules, finding human footprints that weren't mine circling the cabin meant I should pack up and leave immediately. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. These felt different somehow, not threatening, just sad. Like whoever had made them was mourning something instead of hunting it. I decided to stay another night. That decision nearly killed me. The third night started quietly enough. I'd gotten better at the routine: salt lines, iron nails, fire built up before sunset. I was actually feeling somewhat confident, like I was getting the hang of this whole supernatural survival thing. That confidence lasted until around 10 o'clock, when something started testing the iron barriers. I couldn't see what it was from inside the cabin, but I could track its movement by the sounds. Footsteps moving along the treeline, pausing at each spot where Pete had buried his iron spikes. At each spike, there was a sound like metal grinding against metal. Sparks flew briefly in the darkness, and whatever was out there would move on to the next position. It was methodical, systematic. Like something was evaluating the defenses, looking for weak spots or gaps in coverage. The testing went on for over an hour. I sat by the fire, iron nails clutched in both hands, trying not to panic as something circled the property with scientific precision. Finally, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt different than the usual waiting quiet. This felt like focused attention, like something was staring directly at the cabin from the darkness. Then I heard Pete's voice. "Daniel? Danny boy, is that you in there?" My heart nearly stopped. Pete's voice was exactly right. The gravelly rasp from decades of pipe smoking, the slight Appalachian accent he'd picked up over the years, even the affectionate nickname he'd used when I was a kid. "Danny, it's Uncle Pete. I'm not dead, son. The whole thing was a mistake. Open the door, let me in." Every fiber of my being wanted to believe it. The voice was perfect, the words were exactly what I wanted to hear, and God help me, some part of my mind was already making excuses for how it could be true. Mix-up at the hospital, mistaken identity, Pete recovering and coming home to find a stranger in his house. But I'd read his journal. I'd seen 3 decades worth of evidence that things in these mountains could mimic human voices with devastating accuracy. And Pete himself had written about hearing his dead father's voice calling from the woods. Voice mimicry is getting better. Danny, I know you can hear me. I taught you better manners than this. Open the door for your old uncle. The voice was getting angry now, taking on the sharp edge Pete used to use when I disappointed him as a kid. It was so perfectly right that my hand actually moved toward the door handle before I caught myself. Daniel Hayes. The voice roared with Pete's authority. You open this door right now or I'll tan your hide like I should have done years ago. I pressed my hands over my ears and stared into the fire, trying to block out the sound. But the voice followed me, seeming to come from inside my own head. Fine, it said, and now Pete's voice was cold, disappointed. I see how it is. I leave you everything I have and this is the thanks I get. You're just like your father, ungrateful, selfish, too good to listen to family. That hit harder than it should have, because Pete had never talked about my father that way when he was alive. He'd always been diplomatic about the rift between them, never taken sides in family arguments. But this thing wearing Pete's voice was pushing buttons with surgical precision, using intimate knowledge to cause maximum emotional damage. It knew exactly what would hurt me most. I'm disappointed in you, Danny. I thought you were different. I thought you understood what family meant. I lasted maybe another 10 minutes before I broke. Not enough to open the door, but enough to shout back at the darkness. You're not Pete. He's dead. I saw the death certificate. The voice stopped immediately. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and my own ragged breathing. Then something else spoke, something that sounded like Pete but wrong, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. How do you know? The question hung in the air like smoke. How did I know? Because the real Pete would never have spoken to me with such coldness, would never have used my relationship with my father as a weapon. Because the real Pete had spent 30 years learning to respect the things in these mountains, and he wouldn't be standing outside his own cabin breaking his own rules. But mostly because the real Pete had loved me enough to leave me detailed instructions on how to survive in this place, and following those instructions meant not opening doors for voices in the darkness, no matter how familiar they sounded. I didn't answer the question. I just sat by the fire and waited. After maybe an hour, the voice tried a different approach. Daniel, this is Sheriff Morrison from Millbrook. We've been looking for you for 3 days. Your family reported you missing. Sheriff Morrison was a name I'd never heard, and I hadn't told anyone I was coming to the mountains. But the voice was confident, authoritative, exactly how a rural sheriff might sound. Son, we know you're in there. We found your car. We just need to know you're okay. Then, from a different direction, Daniel, this is your mother. Oh, sweetheart, we've been so worried. Please come outside so we can see you're safe. My mother had been dead for 8 years. The voices multiplied over the next few hours. Friends from college, editors I'd worked with, my ex-girlfriend Sarah, even celebrities whose voices I recognized from movies and TV shows. All of them claimed to be looking for me, all of them wanted me to come outside, all of them sounded perfectly, impossibly real. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. The worst moment came around 3 in the morning, when I heard my own voice calling from the woods. Hello? Is someone there? I think I'm lost. It was my voice exactly, not just the tone and accent, but the specific way I pronounced certain words, the slight uncertainty I always had when calling out to strangers. Hearing myself beg for help from the darkness was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. The voice mimicry went on until dawn, a rotating cast of everyone I'd ever known taking turns trying to lure me outside. By the time the sun came up, I was emotionally exhausted and questioning my own sanity. But I was alive. And that morning I found something that made all the terror worth it. Scattered around the cabin were dozens of objects I hadn't seen in the darkness, flowers mostly, but also polished stones, carved wooden figures, and what looked like jewelry made from braided grass and small bones. They weren't threatening. They felt like offerings, like gifts. I remembered Pete's journal entry about leaving tobacco for the things that had helped him. Some of the entities in these mountains weren't hostile. They were just trying to communicate in the only way they knew how. I gathered the offerings carefully, treating each one with the respect I'd give a gift from a friend. Then I walked to the edge of the clearing and left my own offering in return, a pack of cigarettes I'd bought at the gas station but never opened. When I came back the next morning, the cigarettes were gone. In their place was a single white stone carved with symbols that looked almost like writing. I was beginning to understand that Pete's relationship with the mountains hadn't been entirely adversarial. Yes, there were things here that would kill me without hesitation. But there were also things that might be allies, if I learned how to communicate with them properly. That realization changed everything about how I thought about the rules. They weren't just about avoiding danger, they were about maintaining relationships with entities that existed according to their own logic, their own needs, their own sense of what was fair. I was starting to think I might actually be able to survive in this place. That confidence lasted exactly 2 more days. By the end of my first week at the cabin, I'd settled into something resembling a routine. Mornings were for maintenance, checking the salt lines, tending Pete's garden, reading through more of his journals. Afternoons I spent exploring the property, always staying within sight of the cabin but gradually expanding my understanding of the boundaries Pete had established. The iron spike perimeter was more extensive than I'd initially realized. Pete had spent decades placing them in a complex pattern that followed the natural contours of the land, along ridge lines, beside stream beds, at the bases of particularly large trees. Each spike was positioned with mathematical precision, creating a barrier that felt more like a sophisticated security system than random supernatural protection. But it was Pete's notes about the quiet ones that really caught my attention. According to his journal, not everything in the mountains was hostile. There were entities he called the quiet ones, beings that seemed to predate human settlement but weren't actively dangerous. They were the ones leaving gifts, accepting offerings, sometimes even providing warnings about more dangerous creatures. Year 18, the quiet ones left a cluster of red berries on the porch this morning. I've learned this means danger is coming from the north. Last 3 times they've done this, something big has tried to test the barriers within 48 hours. They're trying to help. Year 22, found a pattern of white stones arranged near the well. Same configuration the Cherokee used to mark sacred spaces, according to the anthropology book I borrowed from town. The quiet ones remember the old ways. They're teaching me, Year 27, beginning to understand the hierarchy. The quiet ones are old, but they're not the apex predators here. There's something else, something that even they fear. They've been trying to warn me about it for months, but I'm not smart enough to understand their warnings. Year 29, it's coming. The quiet ones have been leaving black stones for 3 weeks straight. Last night they left a ring of them around the entire cabin. I've never seen them this agitated. Whatever they're afraid of, it's close. The final entry was dated just 2 months before Pete died. Year 30, made contact with the apex predator. It spoke to me in dreams, showed me things I wish I could forget. It's old beyond measure, older than the mountains themselves. It calls itself the Shepherd, and it's been patient because the quiet ones asked it to be. But patience has limits. It wants something from whoever comes after me. A bargain. A trade. I pray Daniel is smart enough to figure out what it needs without paying too high a price. I read that final entry 3 times, my hands shaking worse with each pass. Pete hadn't just been surviving in these mountains, he'd been part of some kind of supernatural ecosystem, maintaining a delicate balance between different types of entities with competing interests. And now that balance was my responsibility. That night, I dreamed for the first time since arriving at the cabin. I stood in a vast cavern deep beneath the mountains, surrounded by walls that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns like living hieroglyphs. The air smelled of copper and wet stone and something organic that reminded me of mushrooms growing in dark places. At the center of the cavern sat something that my mind refused to process completely. It was enormous, maybe 20 feet tall when it sat upright, with too many joints in its limbs and skin that looked like it had been carved from living stone. Its face was almost human but stretched wrong, with eyes that held the patient intelligence of something that had been thinking for geological ages. "You are the nephew," it said, and its voice came from inside my skull rather than through my ears. "The one who inherited the burden." I tried to speak but couldn't make my dream voice work. "Your uncle was wise. He understood the old agreements, maintained the balance for 3 decades. But he is gone and you are untested." The thing leaned forward and I caught a smell like deep caves and ancient bones. "I am called the Shepherd. I tend this place, keep order among my flock. The quiet ones serve me as did your uncle in his way. But there are others who do not accept my authority. Hungry things that would consume everything if left unchecked." Images flashed through my mind, creatures of shadow and teeth, moving through the forest like living nightmares, leaving nothing but bones and silence in their wake. "Your uncle's protections are failing. The iron barriers weaken without proper maintenance. The hungry ones grow bold. Soon they will test boundaries that have held for 30 years. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask. The shepherd's smile revealed teeth like obsidian knives. "A bargain. An exchange. You have something I need, and I have something you need." Your uncle understood this, but he was stubborn. He refused my offer for 30 years, choosing to fight instead of join. "What kind of bargain?" "Service. Become my eyes and hands in the world above. Help me maintain order, cull the hungry ones when they grow too numerous. In return, I will protect you as I protected your uncle, and I will teach you secrets that could make you wealthy beyond imagining." More images flooded my mind: hidden veins of precious metals running through the mountains, underground chambers filled with artifacts that museums would kill for, knowledge that could revolutionize everything from medicine to physics. "Think carefully," the shepherd said. "Your uncle chose the hard path, constant vigilance and eternal struggle. I offer you an easier way, partnership instead of conflict. But choose quickly. The hungry ones gather, and without proper protection, you will not survive another week." I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like cave water and ancient stone. Outside, dawn was just beginning to touch the mountaintops, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful but felt ominous after my dream encounter. The dream had felt more real than any dream I'd ever experienced. I could still smell the cavern, still feel the weight of the shepherd's attention pressing against my mind. And something told me this hadn't been just a dream, it had been a meeting, a negotiation session conducted in the space between waking and sleeping where such things were possible. I spent that morning walking the perimeter of Pete's iron barriers, checking each spike for signs of wear or damage. What I found was disturbing. Several of the spikes showed new scratches and scorch marks, as if something had been testing them with increasing aggression. One spike near the northern boundary had been partially uprooted, its iron surface pitted with what looked like acid burns. The barriers were definitely failing. That afternoon, I found the first sign that the hungry ones were getting closer. I was checking on Pete's vegetable garden when I noticed something wrong with the tomato plants. They were withered and black, as if they'd been hit by sudden frost in the middle of July. But the damage wasn't random, it formed a perfect line running from the garden toward the treeline, like something had walked through the plants and drained the life out of everything it touched. Following the trail of dead vegetation, I found where it ended, at the base of a massive oak tree that had been standing when I arrived but was now nothing but a hollow shell. The bark had fallen away in brittle flakes, the heartwood had rotted to powder, and something had carved symbols into what remained of the trunk. The symbols hurt to look at directly, seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them completely. But their meaning was clear enough: a warning, a threat, a declaration of intent. Something was coming, and it was strong enough to kill an ancient oak tree just by walking past it. I ran back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day reinforcing every protection I could think of. Fresh salt lines, iron nails driven into every windowsill and door frame, burning sage and cedar according to instructions I found in Pete's journal. I built the fire higher than ever and arranged every piece of iron in the cabin within easy reach. As the sun set, I felt like a medieval peasant preparing for a siege by armies I couldn't see or understand. The attack came just after midnight. It started with the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath in the firelight. Then the windows began to rattle in their frames, not from wind but from something pressing against them from outside. The salt lines I'd laid across the thresholds began to smoke and hiss as if they were being corroded by invisible acid. Then I heard them, the hungry ones. They moved through the forest like living shadows, and their voices were the sounds of starvation given form, keening wails that spoke of endless appetite, of things that consumed not just flesh but memories, dreams, the very essence of what made life worth living. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, surrounding the cabin in a tightening circle that pressed against Pete's failing barriers. Where they touched the iron spikes, sparks flew and the metal screamed like a living thing in pain. I clutched an iron poker in both hands and tried to keep the fire burning, but the temperature was dropping so fast that even the flames seemed to be struggling. Ice began forming on the windows, spreading inward in fractal patterns that looked almost like reaching fingers. That's when the shepherd's voice whispered in my mind. "They will be through the barriers in minutes. Your uncle's protections are not strong enough anymore. Accept my bargain and I will drive them back. Refuse and become their feast." Through the windows, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be made of shadow and hunger, with eyes like dying stars and mouths that opened onto nothing but void. "What exactly does the bargain involve?" I asked, speaking out loud to the empty cabin. "Service. You become my agent in the world above. When I have need of something done, you do it. In return, I protect you and teach you. A fair exchange." One of the windows cracked, spider webbing from the pressure of whatever was pressing against it from outside. The hungry one's wails were getting closer, more excited, as if they could smell my fear through the glass. What kind of service? Sometimes I need things brought from the world below. Sometimes I need messages delivered to others like yourself. Sometimes I need problems solved. The euphemism sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the cabin. But as another window began to crack, I realized I might not have much choice in the matter. If I agree, will you honor the arrangement? No tricks, no fine print. I have honored such bargains for millennia. Your uncle could have accepted my offer at any time. He chose the hard path, but the path was always his to choose. The front door was starting to bulge inward, as if something enormous was leaning against it from outside. The iron nails I'd driven into the frame were beginning to glow red hot, and the wood around them was starting to smoke. I made my decision. I accept. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded through the cabin like a tsunami, driving back the cold and making the iron barriers blaze with renewed strength. The hungry ones screamed in frustration and pain as they were forced back beyond the treeline, their voices fading into the distance as they retreated to whatever dark places had spawned them. But the power came with a cost. I could feel the shepherd's presence settling into my mind like a heavy blanket, not controlling my thoughts but definitely monitoring them. We were connected now in a way that would never be completely severed. Good, the shepherd's voice rumbled through my consciousness. The first lesson begins tomorrow night. Be ready. I spent what remained of the night sitting by the fire, trying to process what I'd just agreed to. I'd made a deal with something ancient and powerful to save my life, but I had no idea what the long-term consequences might be. All I knew for certain was that I was no longer just Pete's heir, I was the shepherd's newest employee. And somehow, I doubted the job would come with standard benefits or vacation time. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. I was having coffee on the front porch, enjoying what might be my last peaceful sunrise for a while, when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. A battered pickup truck emerged from the trees, moving slowly up the dirt road that led to the cabin. The truck stopped near Pete's Ford and two people got out. The first was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the scene. The second was a younger man, maybe my age, with the kind of outdoors tan that came from spending most of your life working in the mountains. You must be Daniel Hayes, the woman said, approaching the porch with confident strides. I'm Margaret Sullivan, and this is my nephew Tommy. We were friends of your uncle. Nice to meet you, I said, though something in their manner suggested this wasn't a social call. We felt the disturbance last night, Margaret continued, her eyes studying the scorch marks on the cabin's exterior walls where the hungry ones had tested the barriers. The shepherd made contact, didn't he? I nearly dropped my coffee cup. You know about the shepherd? Tommy laughed, a sound without much humor in it. Son, there are maybe a dozen families in these mountains who know about the old arrangements. We've been keeping the balance for generations while outsiders like your uncle tried to go it alone. Margaret nodded. Pete was stubborn, God rest his soul. We offered to teach him the proper ways dozens of times over the years, but he preferred to figure things out himself. Made it harder on everyone. The proper ways? Working with the shepherd instead of against him, Margaret said. Your uncle spent 30 years fighting a war he could have ended with a simple conversation. The shepherd's not evil, Daniel. He's just old, and old things have different priorities than young things. She gestured toward the forest that surrounded us. This land has been managed for thousands of years. The Cherokee understood that. The first European settlers eventually learned it too. There's a natural order here, a balance between different types of residents. The shepherd maintains that balance. And now I'm part of it? Tommy nodded. Welcome to the family business. It's not as bad as you probably think, and it's not as simple as you definitely hope. Over the next hour, Margaret and Tommy gave me a crash course in supernatural politics that Pete's journal had only hinted at. The mountains were home to dozens of different entities, from the relatively benign quiet ones to apex predators that made the hungry ones look like annoying pets. The shepherd served as a kind of supernatural forest service, keeping the more dangerous creatures in check and managing territories to prevent conflicts. The bargains aren't slavery, Margaret explained. They're more like consulting contracts. The shepherd has needs that require someone who can move freely in the human world, and in exchange he provides protection and knowledge that can be quite valuable. What kind of needs? Sometimes he wants specific items brought to sacred sites, Tommy said. Sometimes he needs messages delivered to other people who have similar arrangements. Occasionally there are problems that need to be solved. that euphemism again. I was beginning to suspect problems that need to be solved was code for something I didn't want to think about too closely. Has anyone ever tried to break their bargain with the shepherd? Margaret and Tommy exchanged a look that suggested the question made them uncomfortable. A few have tried, Margaret said carefully. It doesn't end well. The shepherd doesn't break his agreements, and he expects the same from his partners. But as long as you honor your commitments, he's actually quite fair to work with. They spent the rest of the morning showing me things Pete had never figured out on his own: how to communicate directly with the quiet ones using patterns of stones and offerings, how to identify which areas of the forest were safe to traverse and which were definitely off limits, how to recognize signs that more dangerous entities were becoming active. The key, Tommy explained, is understanding that you're not fighting against the supernatural ecology of this place. You're becoming part of it. Work with the system instead of against it, and everyone benefits. When they left that afternoon, I felt more prepared for whatever the shepherd had planned than I had since arriving at the cabin. I also felt more trapped. The knowledge Margaret and Tommy had shared made it clear that my bargain with the shepherd wasn't a temporary arrangement. It was a fundamental change in what I was and how I would live the rest of my life. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, I felt the shepherd's presence stirring in the back of my mind like a vast animal waking from sleep. "Are you ready for your first lesson?" his voice whispered through my thoughts. I looked around the cabin that was now my home, at Pete's books and journals, at the iron tools and protective barriers that were as much a part of my life now as my morning coffee had been back in Chicago. "I'm ready," I said. And despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the knowledge that I'd just signed away my normal life forever, I realized I was telling the truth. I was ready to learn what it really meant to be part of these ancient mountains. The education began that night. The shepherd's first lesson didn't take place in dreams. Instead, at exactly midnight, I felt a compulsion to walk outside, not the artificial pull of supernatural influence, but the simple knowledge that I needed to be in the forest to understand what I was being taught. I grabbed an iron poker and stepped into the cool mountain air. The night was quiet in a way that felt expectant rather than threatening. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures had faded to respectful silence. "Follow the path of white stones," the shepherd's voice murmured in my mind. I looked around and saw them immediately, a line of pale rocks that I was absolutely certain hadn't been there that morning, leading from the cabin's front porch into the forest. Each stone was perfectly round and seemed to glow with its own faint luminescence. Following the path felt like walking through a living museum. The shepherd's voice provided commentary as I moved deeper into the woods, explaining the history and significance of everything around me. "This oak remembers the Cherokee who carved symbols in its bark 300 years ago. That stream runs through a cave system where my kind first made contact with human settlers. The ridge ahead was a burial ground long before your species knew how to work iron." We walked for maybe an hour, though time seemed fluid in the moonlit forest. Eventually, the path led to a clearing I'd never seen before, despite a week of exploring the property. At its center stood a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that made my eyes water if I looked at them directly. "This is where your uncle came when he needed to speak with me directly," the shepherd said. "Where he brought offerings, received warnings, negotiated the boundaries of his solitude." In the center of the stone circle sat a simple wooden chair, weathered by decades of exposure but still solid. Pete's chair, I realized. His meeting place with forces beyond human understanding. "Sit," the shepherd commanded, and I obeyed. The moment I settled into the chair, my perception expanded dramatically. I could see the forest not just as trees and shadows, but as a complex ecosystem of spiritual energy. Paths of power ran between sacred sites like glowing highways. Different areas pulsed with distinct types of awareness, some benign, some neutral, some actively hostile to human presence. And moving through it all, I could see them, the inhabitants of this hidden world. The quiet ones appeared as gentle glows drifting between trees, tending to spiritual gardens that existed in dimensions I couldn't quite comprehend. Smaller entities flitted through the undergrowth like supernatural fireflies, maintaining the delicate balance between the physical and metaphysical aspects of the forest. But there were darker things too. Predators that stalked through shadow realms adjacent to our own, always hungry, always looking for weakness in the barriers that kept them from the world of flesh and blood. "You see now," the shepherd said, and for the first time, his voice came from outside my head. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his massive form somehow managing to look natural among the ancient stones. "This is what your uncle never fully understood. He saw only threats to be defended against. You must learn to see the entire system." Over the next several hours, The shepherd taught me to read the forest like a living map. I learned to recognize the signs that indicated different types of supernatural activity, to distinguish between entities that might be reasoned with and those that could only be avoided or destroyed. The hungry ones you encountered last night are like wild animals, he explained. They follow simple drives: consume, reproduce, expand territory. They can be managed through strength and proper barriers. He gestured toward a section of forest that appeared normal to my regular vision but glowed with malevolent energy through my enhanced perception. But there are others. Entities with intelligence and agenda that span centuries. They require more sophisticated approaches. Like negotiation? Sometimes. Other times, like surgical removal. The euphemism again, but this time I understood what he meant. Some problems couldn't be solved with iron barriers and protective rituals. Some problems required more direct intervention. Is that what you'll want me to do? Kill things? The shepherd's laugh was like distant thunder. Death is a human concept, Daniel. These entities don't die in any sense you would understand. But they can be relocated to places where they cause less disruption to the balance I maintain. As dawn approached, the enhanced vision began to fade, and the supernatural ecosystem became invisible again. I was left sitting in a circle of ordinary stones in an ordinary clearing, wondering if the entire experience had been an elaborate hallucination. It was real, the shepherd said, reading my thoughts. And it was only the beginning. Return to your cabin. Rest. Tomorrow night, we begin the practical applications. The walk back to the cabin felt like emerging from a deep dream. Everything looked the same as it had when I'd left, but I felt fundamentally changed by what I'd experienced. I wasn't just living in these mountains anymore, I was part of them in a way that went deeper than any human connection to place I'd ever imagined. I spent the day trying to process what I'd learned, reading through Pete's journals with new understanding. His entries made more sense now. He'd been documenting 30 years of living adjacent to the supernatural ecosystem without ever fully becoming part of it. He'd maintained his humanity and independence, but at the cost of never truly understanding what he was dealing with. I was beginning to suspect that my path would be different. That evening, Margaret Sullivan returned alone, bringing a basket of food and what looked like homework. Tommy sends his apologies, she said, settling into one of Pete's porch chairs. He's dealing with a situation up on Devil's Peak. Some college kids decided to go camping in a place they definitely shouldn't have. Are they okay? They will be once Tommy convinces them to leave. The entities up there are territorial, but not actively malicious unless provoked. She handed me the basket. I brought dinner and some reading material. Figured you might be hungry after your first lesson with the shepherd. The reading material turned out to be 3 leather-bound books written in careful handwriting journals kept by other people who'd made bargains with the shepherd over the years. Stories of supernatural problem-solving that read like case studies in applied mysticism. These will help you understand the scope of what you might be asked to do, Margaret explained. The shepherd doesn't make unreasonable demands, but his definition of reasonable might not match yours initially. I flipped through one of the journals, reading entries about relocating hostile spirits, negotiating territorial disputes between different types of entities, and occasionally dealing with humans who'd stumbled into situations beyond their understanding. Have you ever had to solve problems that involved people? Margaret's expression grew serious. Twice in 30 years. Both times involved individuals who were threatening the balance in ways that couldn't be resolved through conversation or conventional means. What happened to them? They were relocated to places more suited to their ambitions. The careful way she phrased it suggested that relocation might be another euphemism I didn't want to examine too closely. We spent the evening discussing the practical aspects of my new role. Margaret explained the communication methods the shepherd used to assign tasks, the resources available to help complete them, and the unwritten rules that govern the supernatural community in the mountains. The most important thing to remember, she said as she prepared to leave, is that you're not alone in this. There are others like us scattered throughout Appalachia, all maintaining the balance in their own territories. We help each other when needed. How many others? Maybe 50, 60 families total. Some have been doing this for generations. Others, like you, are new to the arrangement. She smiled. Don't worry. You'll meet some of them eventually. The shepherd likes to introduce his people to each other when their territories overlap. After she left, I spent hours reading through the journals she'd brought. The stories they contained painted a picture of a hidden world that existed parallel to normal human society, a world where supernatural politics determined the safety of entire communities, where ancient entities maintained territories that had been established before recorded history, where people like me served as intermediaries between realms that rarely intersected peacefully. It was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The second night's lesson was more practical than philosophical. The shepherd led me to a different part of the forest, where something had been disturbing the natural order. I could sense it before I saw it, a wrongness in the air like spiritual pollution that made my enhanced perception itch. A young entity has claimed territory without permission, the shepherd explained. It feeds on fear and has been terrorizing a family that lives at the base of the mountain. This is disrupting the careful balance I've maintained for decades. What am I supposed to do about it? Negotiate first. If negotiation fails, relocate it to somewhere more appropriate. He handed me a cloth bag that clinked when I took it. Inside were iron tools I'd never seen before, not weapons exactly, but implements designed for purposes I couldn't immediately identify. The iron disrupts their connection to this realm, the shepherd said. Used properly, it can force them back to places where they belong. We approached what looked like a perfectly ordinary section of forest, but my enhanced vision showed something else entirely. A dark stain seemed to spread between the trees, and at its center crouched something that made my mind refuse to focus on it directly. Remember, the shepherd whispered, you speak with my authority now. Most entities will respect that. Those that don't. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I stepped forward, clutching the iron tools and trying to project more confidence than I felt. I speak for the shepherd, I called out to the darkness between the trees. You're trespassing on managed territory. The response was immediate and violent. Something shrieked from the shadows, a sound like breaking glass mixed with animal pain. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the trees around me began to wither as whatever was hiding there fed on the life energy around it. Leave, I commanded, raising one of the iron implements. Find territory that hasn't been claimed. Another shrieked, this one closer. I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, something that might once have been human but had been stretched and distorted by hunger and malice until it resembled a living shadow with too many teeth. I warned you, I said, and activated the iron tool the way the shepherd had shown me. The effect was immediate and brutal. Light blazed from the iron implement, not normal light but something that existed on frequencies visible only to supernatural entities. The thing in the shadows screamed and began to dissolve, its connection to our realm severed by forces I didn't fully understand. Within moments it was gone. Not dead, the shepherd had been right about death being a human concept, but relocated to some other dimension where it could feed on fear without disrupting the careful balance of this place. The forest immediately felt healthier. The wrongness in the air dissipated, and the withered trees began to show signs of recovery. Well done, the shepherd said. You learn quickly. Walking back to the cabin that night, I felt a strange mixture of pride and horror at what I'd just done. I'd successfully completed my first supernatural assignment, but the ease with which I'd relocated another sentient being was disturbing. The iron tools had made it feel routine, like filing paperwork rather than fundamentally altering another entity's existence. That feeling will fade, the shepherd said, reading my thoughts. What you did tonight prevented that creature from terrorizing an innocent family. The greater good sometimes requires difficult choices. Over the following weeks, the lessons continued. I learned to identify dozens of different types of supernatural entities, to recognize the signs of territorial disputes and resource conflicts, to negotiate agreements between beings whose motivations I barely understood. Some assignments were relatively simple, mediating disputes between rival factions of nature spirits, relocating entities that had wandered into inappropriate territories, delivering messages between the shepherd and other apex predators who maintained their own domains in distant parts of the mountains. Others were more complex. I helped resolve a situation where a developer from the city had unknowingly built a vacation home on a site sacred to the Quiet Ones. The solution involved convincing the developer that his property was contaminated with toxic chemicals, then arranging for the land to be purchased by a conservation trust that Margaret's family controlled. Nobody got hurt, the sacred site was preserved, and the developer actually made money on the deal. Everyone went home happy. But not all problems could be solved so elegantly. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late August. I was having coffee on the porch, reading through another journal Margaret had lent me when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. Daniel Hayes. The voice was female, middle-aged, with the kind of worry that came from not sleeping for several days. That's me. My name is Carol Winters. Margaret Sullivan said I should call you. We need help. 20 minutes later, Carol Winters sat across from me in Pete's living room, telling me a story that made my blood run cold. Her teenage daughter Emma had been experiencing what sounded like supernatural harassment for the past month. It had started with voices calling her name from the woods behind their house, then escalated to physical manifestations, objects moving on their own, temperature fluctuations, and finally, direct contact. "It touched her," Carol said, her hands shaking as she held her coffee cup. "Left marks on her arms that looked like handprints, but the fingers were too long and there were too many of them." "Have you tried leaving the area?" I asked. "We tried to go stay with my sister in Charleston for a few days. The thing followed us. Emma says it speaks to her in dreams now, tells her she belongs to it, that she can never get away." This was beyond anything I'd dealt with so far. The creatures I'd relocated had been territorial or opportunistic, but they hadn't formed specific attachments to individual humans. This sounded like something much more dangerous. "I'll need to see Emma," I said, "and I'll need to examine your property." That afternoon, Carol led me to a small house tucked into a valley about 10 miles from Pete's cabin. It was a modest place, well-maintained but obviously struggling financially. The kind of home where people worked hard for everything they had and couldn't afford to just pack up and leave when problems arose. Emma Winters was 16 years old, blonde, and carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to expect attack from any direction. The supernatural harassment had left her jumpy and exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of weeks without decent sleep. But it was the marks on her arms that really got my attention. They looked exactly like Carol had described handprints, but wrong in every way that mattered. The fingers were too long, too thin, and there were 6 of them instead of 5. The prints were burned into Emma's skin like brands, dark purple marks that looked infected despite having no actual wounds. "It talks to me," Emma said quietly. "Tells me I'm special, that I belong with it instead of here. Sometimes I almost believe it." That last part worried me more than anything else. Mental influence was a sign of a much more sophisticated entity than the simple predators I'd been dealing with. I spent the rest of the day examining the property with my enhanced perception. What I found was worse than I'd expected. The thing stalking Emma wasn't just some random supernatural predator. It was old, intelligent, and patient. It had been studying the family for months, learning their routines, their fears, their vulnerabilities. The harassment wasn't random. It was a systematic campaign designed to isolate Emma from her support systems and break down her psychological defenses. And it was working. That night, I called the shepherd for guidance. "I need advice," I said, sitting in the stone circle where our lessons took place. "This is beyond anything you've taught me to handle." Describe the situation. I explained everything I'd observed about Emma's stalker. When I finished, the shepherd was quiet for a long time. "You are correct to be concerned," he said finally. "The entity you describe is what your kind would call a demon, though that term carries more religious baggage than accuracy. They are parasitic beings that feed on human spiritual energy, but they require willing cooperation from their hosts to fully manifest in your realm." Willing cooperation? They cannot simply take what they need. The victim must choose to surrender, must invite them in. The harassment you describe is designed to break down the girl's resistance until she makes that choice voluntarily. How do I stop it? You cannot stop it through force alone. Iron tools will hurt it, but it can retreat to other dimensions and return when you're not there to guard the girl. You must either convince it to leave voluntarily or what? Or you must eliminate its reason for staying. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You want me to kill a 16-year-old girl? I want you to consider all available options. The girl's death would certainly solve the immediate problem, but there are other approaches. Such as, the entity wants a willing host. Give it one. Are you suggesting I volunteer? I am suggesting you think creatively about the definition of willing host. I left that night's lesson feeling sick to my stomach. The shepherd's casual suggestion that Emma's death might be an acceptable solution made it clear that his priorities were very different from mine. Maintaining his version of balance apparently took precedence over individual human lives. But there had to be another way. I spent the next day researching everything I could find about demonic entities in Pete's journals and the books Margaret had lent me. Most of the information was fragmentary, but one detail caught my attention. Demons could be tricked into forming contracts with inappropriate hosts, agreements that would ultimately trap them instead of providing the spiritual energy they needed. It was risky as hell, but it might work. The next evening, I returned to the Winters house with a plan that terrified me and a bag full of iron tools that might not be enough to save my life if things went wrong. "I'm going to try something," I told Carol and Emma. "But you need to understand, if this doesn't work, we'll need to consider more extreme options." I didn't tell them what those extreme options might include. Some knowledge wasn't worth sharing. That night, I waited in Emma's bedroom while she and her mother stayed at a neighbor's house. I had a thermos of coffee, a handful of iron nails, and a plan that was probably going to get me killed. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in 10 seconds. "Where is she?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking directly into my mind with the force of a sledgehammer. "Where is my chosen one?" "She's gone," I said aloud. "But I'm here instead." Silence. "Then, you are not suitable. You are already claimed by another." "Actually, I'm not. The shepherd and I have a business arrangement, not a spiritual bond. I'm still available for the right offer." More silence, longer this time. I could feel something vast and malevolent examining me, probing for weaknesses and opportunities. "You would serve willingly?" "I would consider the right deal." "What are you offering?" What followed was the most terrifying negotiation of my life. The demon offered power, knowledge, protection from death and aging, all the classic temptations that had lured humans into spiritual bondage for millennia. I listened carefully, asking questions about the specifics of what it was offering, the terms of service, the duration of any agreement. And with each answer, I laid my trap more carefully. "This sounds attractive," I said finally. "But I have one concern. My current arrangement with the shepherd gives me certain protections in these mountains. If I break that agreement to serve you instead, what guarantee do I have that you can protect me from his retaliation?" "I am far older than the thing you call shepherd," the demon snarled. "My power spans continents while his is limited to these primitive hills." "Prove it." The challenge hung in the air between us. I could feel the demon's rage building, but also its pride. It couldn't resist showing off, couldn't pass up an opportunity to demonstrate its superiority over a rival. "Very well," it said, and power flooded the room. But I was ready for it. The moment I felt that surge of demonic energy, I gripped the iron nails in my pocket and spoke the words I'd memorized from Pete's journal. "I bind you by iron freely given, by bargains freely made, by the ancient laws that govern your kind. You have entered a trap of your own making, and I claim dominion over you by right of conquest." The demon's scream shook the entire house. Windows cracked, plaster fell from the ceiling, and something that felt like psychic lightning tried to fry my brain from the inside out. But the binding held. I tricked it into demonstrating its power in the presence of freely offered iron, creating the mystical equivalent of a short circuit. The energy it had brought to bear on me was now trapped in a feedback loop, contained by the very laws it was used to exploiting. "You cannot hold me forever," it hissed, but the voice was weaker now, more distant. "I don't need to hold you forever," I said. "Just long enough to relocate you somewhere more appropriate." Using the iron tools the shepherd had given me, I began the process of forcing the demon back to whatever realm it had come from. It fought every step of the way, trying to break my concentration with visions of what it would do to me, to Emma, to everyone I cared about when it finally broke free. But the binding held, and after what felt like hours of spiritual warfare, the demon was gone. Not destroyed, that wasn't possible, but sent back to the spaces between dimensions where it would need decades to rebuild enough strength to threaten anyone again. I collapsed in Emma's bedroom, bleeding from my nose and feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. But alive and victorious. The shepherd found me there an hour later. "That was unexpected," he said, examining the scorched walls and cracked windows that marked where our battle had taken place. "And effective. You show promise beyond what I initially suspected. I wasn't going to let you kill a 16-year-old girl. And yet you found a way to solve the problem that didn't require her death. This is wisdom." His massive form settled into the corner of the room like a living shadow. "The demon will not return to this realm for at least 50 years. The girl is safe. What happens now? Now you begin to understand the true nature of the work you've agreed to do. You are not simply my agent in the human world, you are becoming something new. A bridge between realms, someone who can navigate multiple types of existence without being consumed by any of them." Over the following months, my role in the supernatural ecosystem of the mountains became clearer and more complex. I handled disputes between different factions of non-human entities, relocated dangerous creatures that wandered into human-populated areas, and occasionally dealt with humans who'd gotten themselves into supernatural trouble they couldn't handle alone. Some cases were straightforward, convincing a family of nature spirits to relocate away from a hiking trail, negotiating territory boundaries between rival packs of entities I learned to think of as forest wolves, though they bore no resemblance to actual wolves, mediating a conflict between the quiet ones and a group of entities that fed on electrical energy and had been disrupting power lines throughout the county. Others were more complex and morally ambiguous. I helped cover up the disappearance of a paranormal investigator who'd gotten too close to secrets that could have exposed the entire supernatural community. I convinced the developer to abandon plans for a resort that would have been built on top of a site sacred to entities much older and more dangerous than the Shepherd. And yes, occasionally, I dealt with problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or relocation. I tried not to think too hard about those cases. The arrangement wasn't without its benefits. The Shepherd kept his word about teaching me valuable skills. I learned to see spiritual energy the way most people see visible light, to communicate with entities that existed primarily as consciousness without physical form, to manipulate the boundaries between different dimensions in small but useful ways. I also learned that Pete had been right about the practical advantages. Hidden veins of precious metals ran through the mountains, and the Shepherd had no objection to me harvesting small amounts for my own use. Ancient sites contained artifacts that were both spiritually significant and financially valuable to the right collectors. Knowledge of supernatural patterns allowed me to predict and prepare for natural disasters that would catch everyone else off guard. Within 6 months of making my bargain, I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined being as a freelance writer in Chicago. But wealth came with a price I was only beginning to understand. The more I used my supernatural abilities, the more I changed. Not physically, I still looked like the same guy who'd inherited Pete's cabin, but in fundamental ways that went deeper than appearance. I could go days without sleep when working on assignments that required extended spiritual focus. I could survive in freezing weather wearing nothing but a t-shirt, drawing warmth from energy sources that didn't exist in normal human experience. I could sense the emotional states of people around me, sometimes even influence them in subtle ways when necessary for my work. I was becoming something more than human, something less than human, something different from human in ways that I couldn't fully articulate but could feel changing me every day. Margaret noticed the changes first. "You're adapting faster than most," she said during one of her regular visits to check on my progress. "Tommy took almost 3 years to develop the kind of abilities you've manifested in 6 months. Is that good or bad?" "It's concerning," she said carefully. "The people who adapt too quickly to the Shepherd's influence sometimes lose touch with their human connections. They become so focused on spiritual matters that they forget why those matters should matter to someone who used to be entirely human." "Are you saying I'm losing my humanity?" "I'm saying you need to be careful not to. The best people in this line of work are the ones who remember what it was like to be normal, who maintain emotional connections to the human world even as they develop abilities that separate them from it." That conversation haunted me for weeks. Was I still the same person who'd driven up from Chicago 6 months ago? Did I still care about the same things? Did I still value human life and dignity the way I had before learning that humans were just one species among many competing for resources and territory in a much larger ecosystem? I wasn't sure I liked the honest answers to those questions. The real test came in early spring, when the Shepherd assigned me a case that forced me to confront exactly how much I'd changed. A family of 4 had moved into a house built on land that had been claimed by a particularly territorial group of entities for over a century. The human family had no way of knowing about the supernatural significance of their new property, but their presence was driving the entities to increasingly aggressive behavior. Standard procedure would be to convince the family to move, either through supernatural harassment that would make them want to leave on their own, or through more direct human intervention, job transfers, financial incentives, manufactured emergencies that required relocation. But this family was different. The father was a veteran who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan and finally found a house that was wheelchair accessible and within his disability budget. The mother was caring for her elderly parents who couldn't be easily moved. The 2 children, both under 10, had already started at new schools and were beginning to make friends for the first time since their father's injury. Moving them would destroy their lives in ways that went beyond simple inconvenience. The entities, on the other hand, had legitimate claims to the territory. They'd maintained spiritual guardianship over the land for generations, and their connection to it ran deeper than human concepts of property ownership could accommodate. Forcing them to relocate would be equivalent to spiritual genocide. Both sides had rights. Both sides had needs that couldn't be compromised without causing genuine harm. I spent weeks trying to find a solution that would work for everyone. I negotiated with the entities, offering alternative territories and compensation for their displacement. I researched the family situation, looking for ways to help them relocate that wouldn't destroy their financial stability or emotional well-being. Nothing worked. The entities wouldn't budge, and the family couldn't afford to move even if they wanted to. Finally, the Shepherd called me to the stone circle for a consultation. "You have spent too much time on this problem," he said. "The solution is simple. The entities were here first. The humans must go. They can't go. Moving would bankrupt them and probably destroy the father's mental health. He's already dealing with PTSD from his military service. Then they will adapt to sharing the space, or they will be removed by methods that don't require their cooperation. The casual way he said it made my blood run cold. You're talking about killing them? I am talking about maintaining the balance I was placed here to protect. Individual human suffering is regrettable, but it cannot be allowed to override the needs of entities whose claims predate your species' arrival in these mountains. I stood in that ancient stone circle, looking at a being older than human civilization, and realized that I'd reached the point Margaret had warned me about. The choice between my humanity and my supernatural obligations. No, I said. Excuse me? I said no. I won't be part of murdering an innocent family because it's convenient for your version of balance. The shepherd's eyes blazed with power that could have vaporized me on the spot. You seem to have forgotten the terms of our agreement. I haven't forgotten anything. But our agreement was for service, not slavery. And it definitely didn't include becoming a serial killer for the sake of territorial disputes. For a moment, I thought he was going to kill me right there. Energy crackled around his massive form, and the temperature in the clearing dropped so fast that frost formed on the standing stones. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. You have grown stronger than I anticipated, he said. Strong enough to refuse me when your principles demand it. This is interesting. What happens now? Do you kill me for breaking our agreement? You have not broken our agreement. You have simply reached the point where the agreement must evolve to accommodate what you have become. He studied me with those ancient eyes. You are no longer simply my agent in the human world. You have become something new, a mediator between realms, someone with the power to make decisions that affect multiple species. I don't understand. The family and the entities, find a way for them to coexist. You have the knowledge and abilities to create new types of solutions. Use them. What followed was the most challenging supernatural negotiation I'd ever attempted. Instead of trying to convince one side to give up their claims, I worked to restructure the nature of the claims themselves. Working with both the family and the entities, I helped establish a formal agreement that recognized the spiritual significance of the land while allowing human habitation. The family agreed to maintain certain areas of their property as sacred spaces that would never be developed or disturbed. The entities agreed to limit their activities to times and areas that wouldn't interfere with normal human life. Most importantly, I helped both sides understand that they could benefit from cooperation. The entities' connection to the land gave them knowledge of environmental changes that could protect the family from natural disasters. The family's presence provided a buffer against other humans who might be less respectful of supernatural claims to the territory. It took months to work out all the details, but eventually we had an arrangement that both sides could live with. Not perfect, but workable. You have done well, the shepherd said when I reported the resolution. You begin to understand the true nature of balance, not the dominance of one species over others, but the integration of different needs into systems that serve everyone's interests. Is this what Pete could never figure out? Your uncle was too focused on maintaining his independence. He saw cooperation as surrender. You understand that cooperation can be a form of strength. As spring turned to summer and I approached my first anniversary at the cabin, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. I was no longer the broke freelance writer who'd driven up from Chicago with nothing but a duffel bag and a bad attitude about rural living. I was something new, still human in most ways that mattered, but connected to realities that most humans never suspected. I had abilities that would have seemed like magic a year ago, knowledge that spanned multiple realms of existence, and responsibilities that affected the lives of entities I was still learning to understand. Most importantly, I had purpose in a way I'd never experienced before. Every case I worked on mattered, not just to me but to entire communities of humans and non-humans whose lives depended on someone being willing to stand at the intersection of different worlds and help them coexist. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd somehow become suited for. That evening, sitting on Pete's porch and watching the sun set behind mountains that held more secrets than I'd ever imagined, I realized I was happy in a way that had nothing to do with comfort or security or conventional success. I was home. The phone rang just as I was heading inside for the night. The caller ID showed Margaret's number. Daniel? We've got a situation up in Mason County. Something's been killing livestock and leaving behind symbols that none of us recognize. Sheriff thinks it might be a cult, but the patterns look supernatural to me. I grabbed my jacket and the bag of iron tools that had become as much a part of my equipment as my car keys. I'll be there in an hour, I said. Just another night in the life of someone who'd learned to navigate the spaces between worlds. Just another chance to help maintain the balance that kept both humans and non-humans safe in these ancient mountains. Just another reminder that some inheritances come with responsibilities you never see coming, and sometimes those responsibilities turn out to be exactly what you never knew you needed. I drove into the darkness, ready for whatever was waiting in Mason County, knowing that Uncle Pete would have been proud of the man I'd become in the shadow of his mountain home. The rules had kept me alive long enough to learn that survival was just the beginning. Everything else was about learning how to live.